Good evening. I'm Patty Wickman, professor in the UCLA Department of Art and acting chair. I want to extend a warm welcome to the first UCLA School of the Arts and Architecture Department of Art Visiting Artist Lecture of the 2019-2020 academic year. We're grateful to the Hammer Museum for hosting the lecture and for the generous support of the William D. Feldman Family Endowed Art Lecture Fund for making this event possible. The Department of Art is honored to have Hannah Black with us as a speaker tonight and as a visiting faculty member for the fall quarter. Miss Black is an artist and writer from the UK living and working in New York. She received a BA in English at King's College, University of Cambridge, and completed Art Foundation at London's Working Men's College. She went on to receive an MFA in art writing from Goldsmiths College, University of London, and completed the Whitney Independent Study Program with a studio concentration. Ms. Black has exhibited recently at Performance Space, New York, the Sharjah Biennial in the United Arab Emirate, Eden, Berlin, Contemporary Art Center, Geneva, Chisenhale Gallery, London, MoMA, Vienna, and Arcadia Missa, London. She has read and performed at the Contemporary Art Center, Geneva, the Pompidou in Paris, and MoMA PS1 in New York, among other venues. Ms. Black has proved herself willing to address head-on difficult political, moral, and racial issues in the art world. It is with great respect and pleasure that I introduce Hannah Black. Thank you.
Hey, cool. I was imagining it's full and I feel happy it's not. I'm going to start with a David Anton poem that my friend Laura read to me recently. It's like one of his poems where he kind of speaks and he composes the poem as he's speaking, but then these are kind of like, then it's sort of concretized as a text. I wanted to talk about something, the situation that comes up when a poet comes to a place to do something that is a poem. I mean, what am I doing coming here to talk poetry? That is, if I thought that poetry was a sort of Roman enterprise, if I thought that poetry was a Roman enterprise, I would assume that talking poetry was a reasonable and clear-cut enterprise. I would get to the place and then use all the wonderful rhetorical charm that I could put behind me and offer you poetry. That is, I would improve talking, you see. Talking would be just talking, the way people talk, and poetry would be improved talk. It would be talk that ends kind of funny. It rhymes, say, or it beats out a tune, or it does what it does in some unusual and exotic way. There's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people do it. It's fun walking tightropes. It's fun talking while drinking water. It's fun talking while standing on your head. I propose not to consider poetry putting something on top of talk. I consider it, in this case, coming with a kind of private occasion to a public place. I mean, you're all here, and it's a public place, and I'm addressing a public situation, and I'm doing what poets have done for a long time. They've talked out of a private sense, sometimes from a private need, but they've talked about it in a rather peculiar context for anybody to eavesdrop, which is strange that a man would come out here to talk to you, not knowing you not knowing him, and you should care about anything he has to say, and it's exotic. There's something strange about it, except that if we share some aspect of humanness, it may be perhaps less exotic. That is, people have been known to walk into a bar, find someone they didn't know, and start a conversation with this person, tell them their life story, disappear, and never see them again. That's the poem. I'm going to basically, I think the first three things I'm reading are just, I'm literally doing three kind of readings. The first one's more like a recitation because I happen to have memorized it. Try not to be too impressed because people seem to find it like mind-blowing that I've memorized it, but it's from a performance. So I'm gonna read these three readings, and then I'm going to talk you through some of the ideas behind an exhibition, and then hopefully that'll have been at least an hour, and then we can have a Q&A, and it'll be crazy and fun. But so so I did this performance series called Anxietina. I mean, well, whatever, called several names. Like when we did it at PS1, it was called All Life, or when we did it in this version at the Centre d'Art Contemporain in Geneva, it was which means the contemporary art, the Center of Contemporary Art. It's also multilingual. It was called Anxietin, which is basically like so basically this was a performance that I did with my friend Soraya Lutangu, who makes music under the name Bonaventure. It's really good. I recommend you check it out. And my friend Ebbe Franzen Waldhor, who's like a textile designer and in this case set designer. And anxiety. The concept of Anxietina was like a superhero whose superpower was anxiety. We started working. We got commissioned by the ICA, whatever. I mean, I think we got paid like £150 each by the ICA in London. I want to be real about the conditions of art labour to do this performance, and I was taking everything very. It was 2016. It was just after Brexit. It was before Trump, but after Brexit. So it was in the period where people from the UK knew what was happening, but Americans didn't know. Many Americans had no idea, and like so we were like so I was like convinced it was gonna. I was like, we're gonna do this. This is gonna be in Trump's America or whatever, so we have to do something. And at that time I also think was very invested in the idea of art as kind of therapeutic. I think it was something I thought, I know it's something you constantly have to cut that belief in yourself. I feel like you I don't know, maybe not everyone, but I constantly have to address that belief in myself. So I had the idea we were making something kind of therapeutic, but then of course in the effort to make something therapeutic about the era, it ended up just like this kind of post-apocalyptic kind of thing with this anxiety superhero. The idea that you could somehow, I mean, it's never really clear what the superpower becomes, but whatever. So the first thing I'm going to recite to you is from that, this was the sorry, I should say something about the set. This was the set. It was part of a whole exhibition at the in Geneva, and it was the kind of inflatable fake walls you see were actually from a company that makes these kind of like inflatable walls for police and military training. So you can see, so the video, if you see there's some video screens and they show, sometimes they show the set and sometimes they show the kind of training footage where you see like, you know, like soldiers like bursting into a domestic situation or like whatever they're training for or whatever. Then we had a kind of weird like ethical twist after the show where in order to recoup some of the costs of the production of the exhibition, they wanted to resell these walls to like local police. And I was like, I did not get into art to be an arms dealer or whatever. But so they didn't do that in the end. But it was like kind of that's what these things are. And it was like, anyway. So this is from the text and part of it, and it's from different parts of the performance. So yeah, that's just. So at the start of the film or the dream, there's been. So at the start of the film or the dream, there's a dark sea in which, without cause, an egg appears, and inside the egg is the concept of endlessness, and it splits itself in two to get born. At the cross corner, they sell souvenirs from this incomprehensible no time that cuts across the feeling of having a body, small figurines that can be melted down or swallowed or kept in the pocket. Into this scene, allow something exactly not like understanding to walk through all of the less radiant strangers and into the ongoing aliveness of the attention. So at the start of the film or the dream, there's been a small mistake, and two figures cross the burned desert of this small mistake, or they cross the desert of there are no mistakes. Now we return to the ending, that feeling when world politics looks like bro performance art, because who cares what happens? Me no more than they do, but with a gaping hole at the center, running in the street where the guts are holding the hand that once held the guts that once. Now back to the desert with something like relief and the two figures that the eye has been trained to see. Now consider the perspective. Is it a government operative? Is it a neutral third party? Is it the eye of Never mind, because one is a woman with a mouth and an eye and a permanent keloid marking a line from lip to forehead, and she is as black as the day and night is, but played by Charlize Theron. So don't worry, don't worry. I will write the email and I will explain the backstory of the burned desert, but it isn't interesting, or it's only interesting. And when the time comes to explain it, you are out back in the toilets, giving your heart to the only person in town who truly knows themselves to be God's child, because what else could explain all this? Any more than the cinematography traces the footsteps that lead inexorably to the woman who now, with the only arms of a woman still left, traces a circle bisected by the horizon and turns to the other and smiles very wide. And we have still yet to see the credits unfold and get located in time and space and value before a smell like everything that will ever happen has already happened, has filled the theatre. I know that there is more than common feeling, but wait for me there just in case. The child walking sideways has a soft, heavy face, and a series of bad situations have abolished the strength of the hand, which there is no one left to mourn, because there are only two, and the child with its sideways walk goes sideways, while the one who is laughing bends the cavern of the heart, which is all that we know of the ribs, to the ground, where the dark sand running is played by a number of actresses who are all here to accept the award, but there is only one and one. Periphery and center is a stupid way to think about a sphere, but we go on like that. So stupid. I care for you. Forgive me. Something has definitely gone wrong. So that's that. And this is from an installation in Sharjah that was extremely laborious and basically hardly anyone saw, and then it kind of fell apart in the heat. But we said it was deliberate. It deliberately fell apart in the heat. It was totally intentional. So this I did with Ebba Franzen-Walter, who I mentioned before, who was like the set designer for the Anxietina performance, and it was a kind of collab, and these were like little figures. The structure was like, I mean, I should have had a picture for you of the outside, but it was basically like a box structure that was like on top of it was in this beautiful kind of whatever. I mean, whatever. It was like this box structure. There were like holes in the structure, and then these kind of like face-shaped holes, and they would come in and kind of activate these sculptures that were made of bits of like broken old tarmac, kind of from roads or whatever, that were local. And so it was basically an inverse sundial that, and I think it's kind of an interesting, maybe it's, we made an interesting mistake, which is I think we tried to approach it very technically. So we did we did a lot of like complicated computer modeling. It's really hard to like, this was actually extremely hard. It was like, where's the sun? Like, what's the angle? Like, what time of day? Like, obviously it's like in a different part of the planet. So whatever. Anyway, the whole thing was like extremely complex. I think basically towards the end, I think we realized that what would have made more sense is to just kind of go there and kind of like do a kind of physical model and like place things according to the sun. But we didn't think of that at the time. So we spent a huge amount of time and effort on this like extremely complex like inverse sundial. And so as the sun kind of hit the sculpture and kind of gave it a face, it's like it would come alive for like 10 or 15 minutes, and then it would kind of speak. So I'm going to read you like a kind of edited down version of one of the speeches that one of these little guys would give when he was like alive for a while. I was thinking a lot about, for some reason I was thinking about content moderation. Because there was a lot of like, I'd read a couple of things like kind of long form or like whatever, like kind of news essays or whatever that were about the kind of trauma of the content moderator, which seemed to me like such an interesting kind of like contemporary traumatized figure or whatever, like a kind of trauma, almost like a kind of displacement or whatever, because the trauma is not so much about, a bit like the kind of whatever. Anyway, sorry, I won't get into this, but so you might kind of perceive that as an influence, and then I guess a lot, and the other stuff is kind of I think somewhat obvious, kind of whatever. Anyway. I've been learning a lot about them. If you'll let me try to explain, because I think I know a thing or two. I've been here for a while, and I'm learning a lot. I wouldn't say they are learning about me. Of course, I should show you some more of these pictures. Sorry. There you go. You get the kind of idea. But imagine it's him. I wouldn't say they are learning about me. Of course, you don't know what they're really thinking. I watch things. I listen. Some of the things stay with me. Like a man I saw in a video holding up his hands and saying, please, please. And if you think about it, what he's asking for, it's not much, it's just a little more time. You wonder if it would be better for them not to be so vulnerable to time. Of course, then they would have to be more like us. Later, he asks for his mother. Obviously, I can't really say anything about that because I don't know what that's like to have a mother or even really what it's like to not have a mother. But I think about it. I do my research. I think it's key. I think you have to think about it if you want to understand them. And when you do understand them, you ask yourself, is this a form of being I'm really interested in getting involved in? Like, as much as they might be interesting historically and intellectually, as much as they might be interesting as a set of problems, like how a math question or a puzzle can be interesting, there's still the question of if it's interesting to leave the realm of objects for that particular kind of subjectivation. I have to say, I'm not sure. They sing songs like this. Oh, death, death, death. Oh, love, love, love. All their songs are about love and death. You can imagine, and none of it is really suitable for us. I saw a video of two little kids. After everything I've seen, I'm always tensed up, anticipating something, but everything seems okay here. Their mother is pregnant, and they want to know how she got pregnant. She's laughing because she can't answer. It's true. I can tell you straight up that I'm a semi-solid petroleum derived from the corpses of everything that lived before language, and we all talk about that all the time. But humans aren't exactly like us. The children are asking how the baby got inside her, and she's laughing. Your father and I were together, she said. They want to know when. They want to know what they were doing when this happened. It was at night, she says. You were probably sleeping. And they're so cute, these girls, and you're so tired sometimes from watching all the long-distance close-up violence. You want to reach your hands into the frame and scoop them out and bring them back into the world of objects where they can't be living or dead. Quite the species. We maintain this expectation that we all want to be reborn as flesh, but it's more important to be happy than successful. That's what I want to say to the gravel, the sand, the mountains, the roads. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves as objects. It's like, do I want the privileges that being human might bring? Sure, some of them, but I appreciate a lot about my situation. I think that when you get there, when you're more incarnated, you might feel at first like you've hit the big time, but it brings its own problems. This is just from observation. Not everyone is that interested. Some people just clock in, do the work, go dark. Some people don't stay conscious because they find it tiring. But I take an interest. I watch their movies. I go on their internet and I see a lot of things. I don't judge, but I do see a lot of different types of things. In the video, there's the two little girls, twins, and you can tell they're suspicious of what their mother is saying. They're confused about how the baby got inside her body. They ask if she used a sharp knife. Well, in a way, she used a sharp knife. The mother is laughing. The kids' brows are furrowed. They look angry. And I felt, watching this, that I was learning a lot about what's being asked of us, that it's not all it's cracked up to be. People talk it up a lot. Desire, mortality, caring about your mortality, experiencing yourself moving across time. I think there's a lot to be said for time staying objective. I'm rubble, and I'm not ashamed of that. I'm not a monument. I'm not trying to get respect. Though as petroleum, I do expect a certain amount of respect, but I'm not trying to become someone. I know my history. I don't blame myself because it's humans who made me, but I understand my part in it. They sing songs with words like this. Life can be understood, yeah, life can be understood. They sing songs with words like, the universe is scalable to the finitude of life. We think of the universe in terms of size. It's really cute. It's adorable. I understand how some people get into it. But I mean, I never lived and died, and my father never lived and died, and his father never lived and died, all the way back until the first. That was a long time ago. The kids are very curious about the baby. I'm serious. The mother tells the kids one or two things, but you can see they don't understand the whole story. They have no idea of the story of how the baby got in there, and she's not sure yet how to tell them. And you just wish you could talk to them, really talk to them. Not only like this, when the sun's here and there's some kind of mechanism and everything happens more or less as planned. You want to reach beyond the bright line of distinction between what does and doesn't happen and say immeasurable things about the life of things that don't have to believe themselves alive. You want to say, you don't have to live like this. To the kid just about to find out how babies are born, you want to say, when they tell you, kid, you're going to lose your mind and you're never going to get over it. You're never, ever, 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 ever going to get over it. You're never, ever, ever, ever going to get over it. They could melt you down and stick you all over with tar, and you would not be moved from the task of never getting over it. And you would not be moved from the will to never get over it. They could put all the hands in the world in your mouth and you'd never get over it. When you hear about how babies are made, kid, when you hear the amazing, the incredible, the terrible, the horrifying, the wonderful, the unbelievable truth about babies and where they come from, where they don't come from, where they do and don't come from, where they come from, you are never, ever, ever going to get over it. When you hear what this means for you, kid, you will never get over it. When you hear what can be done and not done, what can be done and not done, what can be done and not done with yourself, you will never get over it. When you hear what can be known and not known, what we know and don't know, what you will and won't know, you will never get over it. Call me up when they give you the news, when you ask about babies. I want to hear what you think when you do, when you know about babies. You think because I come from the light of the sun, I don't know about babies, because I was born in a mineral sludge, but your language is threaded all through with it. So that's what they say. This is from, sorry, the picture's kind of small, so they did it small. So this was from a performance called Penumbra. We had to come up with the title really in advance, so that's why the title's Penumbra. It has very little to do with the performance, but that's fine. That's how things work. So it was a performance with Juliana Huxtable that we did at Performance Space in New York. It was, did I put another? Oh no, I didn't, sorry. It's a shame I didn't put more pictures because the set was very incredible. So because the people the set designers I work with, we kind of constructed this entire like a kind of legal drama, courtroom. We were looking at kind of like Judge Judy kind of references or whatever. So there were also like TV screens that were like relaying my face, and the audience sat in a kind of on benches like you would in a courtroom or whatever. So it's kind of based. Juliana was really interested in this movie Inherit the Wind, which was based on Inherit the Wind. Maybe someone's seen it. It's about this what's it called, the Scopes trial. I think it was a trial, a kind of. The ACLU wanted to do a kind of test trial. I think it was the ACLU in somewhere in the South, I think in Tennessee, and they got this teacher to kind of volunteer. This is the true story. The true story is they got a teacher to kind of volunteer to say that he'd been teaching evolution in classrooms in a high school in order to kind of test the law that was on the books that said it wasn't allowed to teach things that were kind of against the Bible or whatever, and it became very famous. The movie is the play, and then the movie that was made of the play are kind of intended to kind of use the trial as a kind of analog or analogy for kind of the McCarthy hearings. So that's kind of multi-layered, and then also when I was like doing research, I think Juliana was interested from the point of view of a kind of like legal poetry or whatever. So you have a lot of these kind of scenes where someone, like people are doing kind of like a classic in the kind of like the like law movie or whatever, where people give these like amazing speeches that like change the course of everything or whatever. So she was interested in that as a kind of poetic form. When I looked up about it, like, of course, this famous free speech case, whatever you can guess, it turns out the textbook that evolution was being taught from is also an extremely racist, white supremacist, eugenicist book or whatever, so it's kind of, whatever. So, I'm just telling you this because in some ways it doesn't appear that strongly in the performance, but these were the kind of materials we were working with, and then the format of the performance was that I was the prosecution, Juliana was the defense, and I'm going to read you the opening speech of the prosecution, which I wrote, and then that'll be the last reading, and then we're going to talk a bit. I'm going to talk to you a bit about this exhibition, and then I'm going to show you a 4-minute video, and then you can ask me questions if you want. Okay, so good evening. My name is Hannah Black, and I feel honored to serve as the prosecution in this important case. Oh, by the way, anyway, it doesn't matter. Sorry, the defendant was a real frog. I really want you to know this. We initially wanted an octopus, but an octopus cost 20,000. This is such a sad story. An octopus cost a professional octopus, like a gigantic red octopus, which would have been beautiful and come in its own tank with its own handlers or whatever. That cost $20,000, which was like the entire budget. So we were like, okay, unfortunately, we can't have the octopus. I was very sad about it because, and then, so then I was like, oh, maybe we could get. Then we were like, maybe we could get a restaurant octopus. In the meantime, we'd found out all this stuff about how you have to give octopuses toys because and play the music because otherwise they constantly try and escape. And so then we kind of went and looked at restaurant octopuses, and it was just like it was so devastating. And they're like, oh, they might die, but like you could take it was so fucking sad. And then just because there's something about like it's being subjectivated by the legal process, even though, and by being a performer, you feel like it'd be extra horrifying for it to then like just die after that or whatever. And also you can't just put it in the sea because it needs to be gradually like reacclimatized to like proper salt water or whatever. So like the fucking situation of octopuses is so bad. And I was talking to a friend about it at one point, and I was like, I'm not even a vegan or anything. I was just like, I'm so devastated about octopuses. And I was like, oh, I think it's because they're really smart or whatever. And my friend was like, no, because that's not really. My friend was basically like, no, what's extremely moving about them isn't their intelligence, is that they constantly try and escape. It's like you feel that, and that's like if you read any like octopus literature, there's a beautiful piece in the LRB about octopuses that I really recommend. But that they are constantly like it is like actually a thing, and people are like just like pragmatically telling you like they need toys or whatever. But yeah, so that was really devastating. So in the end, we ended up with we just put it out on Craigslist for like beautiful and extraordinary animals, and we ended up with this frog. So that's and then other things were kind of represented with like video and other kind of devices or whatever. So okay. So I feel honored to serve as the prosecution in this important case. The defendant, a female albino African claw frog representing all animals or the animal as such, stands accused of being disgusting, making people feel disgusting, cannibalism, and the murder of everything. You will hear the defense argue that it is the human who has maintained the division of life into animal and non-animal between so-called thought and so-called experience, but they are completely wrong, and as the case unfolds, I will demonstrate why. Through the use of language, I will show you, and you will understand, and in doing so, admit that you do not fundamentally sympathize with the principle of the animal. You respond to abstract concepts. You know how to come when your name is called. I should say that the jury, which you can see just kind of behind, this was flies on the stand. I called a witness of flies. And so that's just like a fly trap thing. And then if you can just see behind it, there was like a shadows of animals. So the jury was like shadows of animals. And then the judge was an ant colony. Which was real ants, but on a projector so you could actually see them. We have tried to hold on to the collective being, but the animal has continually refused to speak to us. All that we know about brutality, we learned from animals. We learned how to treat each other as food. We learned how to die indifferently. This case is about the practice of making a cut. Its scope is beyond historical. It goes back to the first spark that fell by the will of chance from outer space and into a pool of longing, about making a cut, about water then, and also electricity, about making a cut, about feelings, about talking about feelings, about hiding feelings, about repackaging feelings as thoughts or as repetitions, about making a cut, about not having any feelings but noticing that you don't have any and how that feels. The human keeps attempting to become one with the animal by admitting our emergence from it, and the animal keeps repudiating us by dying or disappearing. We are heartbroken to see the animal go and would not have wished it. We will hear about the complicated mediations between living and dying, but none of it will prove the defendant's innocence, and none of it will prepare you for what you've already been through. The jury will have heard about dissent, but it is not true that anyone is descended from anything. Time is not a hole. We are not eating a hole in the fabric of time. No offense, of course, to Your Honor the Judge who lives like that. Of course, that's the investiture of justice, that holes have to be eaten in the fabric of the social in order to form the legal subject, who is absolutely differentiated from the slave or the animal by his freedom to work or starve. Perfect justice would be the shared head constantly eating, but that's not even imaginable in current social conditions, and there has been no dissent. What there's been is a range of activities, filling up a whole field, a flat space, at least 50% horizon, where I invite the jury and everyone in the courtroom to come and meet me and figure out only then how to live, beyond the tyranny of the animal, and how it impugns the human who has done nothing but attempt to imbue the real with meaning. Without the shadow of the animal, no offense to the jury, we would not care if love was indiscriminate. Instead of the line of distinction across which I'm made to consider the problem of mercy, the sanctioned violence of sex, that's not what use and exchange mean. For a moment, a few hours at most, the almost verbal darkness of the shared room of the body, nothing to live by. These appearances and disappearances cause discomfort. In nomadic time, there is no dissent, but a concept can't overrule imperial borders, penetrating blank fields of desert as if in preparation for the blank fields of desert. The point isn't species diversity as a moral category, but that a multitude of ways could be found to live. We could still not all, but some of us meet in the flat expanse where we will learn from each other what to do there. The gravity of value whose weight directs us to hell is what has ruined the category of the animal and not the existence of the human. It is not the human that has to be addressed. The animal carries the programmatic virus of all that has been done to the human, the feeling that the body formally references the practice of breeding or of starving. Biology is already a slur. Wherever it comes, we are compelled to resent it. It was in the first moment, the first slippage between the child body and the one that later would be more fully inhabited by the animal of sex. It was afternoon and later it was evening. The genitals at that time were sometimes like the underside of an insect, like the moment of revulsion when the butterfly turns out to be just a bug after all. Deep shadow indoors and the barefoot touching, cool, robbed of claws and hide, just walking, the head born first and exposed uppermost to the sun, always prematurely, so you have to learn to speak eventually, to say so that technically you were not born, only your head was born, and the body ideally behind it. There is no wrong way to do a thing that never happened. I feel confident that the jury will come to agree with me. So that's that. Okay, so this is, maybe I speak for like, 20 more minutes maybe. So thank you so much for your patience in listening. This is a show at Eden, which is one of Isabella Bortolozzi's galleries in Berlin. And it was called Eater, Aeter, which was... is from the Old English word for cannibal, which is self-eater, but actually has an A on the end. Whatever, I did some weird things with the word. That's what the show was called. I'm gonna read you the press text was like a series of quotes. The first one is a tweet by someone on Twitter whose is like at YZPLZ, who I don't know in real life, but seems cool. The tweet is, "God made us so he could eat us." The second quote is from an online etymology dictionary. Etymology, I'm always like, etymology is like the refuge of like losers or whatever, but I'm constantly kind of going to it, but I feel like it's the thing you do when you don't know what else to do. But anyway, so this is from the online, this is a cool etymology though, it's a cool derivation. For cannibal, human that eats flesh, 1550s, from Spanish cannibal, carabal, a savage, cannibal, from Cannibal, Christopher Columbus's rendition of the Caribs' name for themselves, often given in modern transliterations as Calino or Carina, see Carib, and compare Caliban. An Old English word for cannibal was self-eater. Third is from Peter Linklater and Marcus Rediker's book, The Many-Headed Hydra, which I was like super into, a fun Marxist history. This is about the English upper class. Though of course they themselves were the cannibals, many upper class people took medicinal mummy concocted from human cadavers and believed to be particularly potent when made from the hanged or Libyans. So that's that's like the kind of like détournement of the kind of the cannibal slur or whatever, or kind of however you think about that. Actually, while I was preparing for this talk, I read some stuff about like, is it ethical to theorize the cannibal, which is by Manuel Abreu. So that's an interesting question. But But I mean, I guess I'm not theorizing it. I'm just making some art. So and the next one is, I know Winnicott is so big in LA. It's so crazy, but or maybe because the Darcy English talk was like a Winnicott talk, whatever. And anyway, so this is a Winnicott quote from Hate and the Countertransference. Let me give some of the reasons why a mother hates her baby. He tries to hurt her, periodically bites her, all in love. He excites her but frustrates. She mustn't eat him or have sex with him. So that's why mothers resent their babies. And then this is from a book about the origins and history of the idea of the curse of Ham. A drunken Noah accidentally exposed himself. His son Ham sinfully looked at him, and as punishment, Noah cursed Ham's son Canaan with servitude. With servitude, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. And then the last one is from a kind of Brazilian modernist manifesto called the Cannibalist Manifesto. But those who came here weren't crusaders. They were fugitives from a civilization we are eating because we are strong and vindictive. So those are the press text quotes. This is yeah. So oh yeah. Okay. So this was the thing you can see in the center was there were two things made of it. Initially they were made of a thing I've used several times, which is kind of like modeling clay, which doesn't harden, it stays soft. You can always change it. And which I kind of have. I mean, whatever. It's a fairly like basic interest or whatever. But I guess it's just something about like, oh, like the object is kind of sealed by its like moment of commodification or of display, kind of. So it's like it's kind of potentially infinitely, which is kind of obviously what a pretty ordinary kind of observation about the process of art making or whatever. There's a point where you're not maybe you're not done, but it's now it's kind of fixed because it's been to some extent like commodified or whatever. So these were two kind of weird blobby sculptures that were in the center of the two main rooms, and then during the course of the exhibition, the idea was that the invigilators, people who were working in the gallery, would take a handful of clay from one to the other, and so they would kind of eat each other over the course of the show. Initially, because there was sort of two themes running, there was a kind of I was kind of working through a lot of stuff. So the idea of cannibalism was one of the things I was drawing on quite heavily was the first few chapters of Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, where he spends a lot of time on like the kind of very bad situation of kind of pre-colonial Europe or whatever, like after basically the kind of like sort of era of kind of general social collapse around like the 11th century, where things were so bad that people were literally like eating each other. There's like a quote from Braudel, who's another kind of famous Marxist historian, about people literally selling like barbecued human meat at a kind of whatever you'd call it, like a market in France. So the situation was bad, and obviously the book is Robinson begins the book like that because he wants to make a point about kind of Europe's already invented race before it kind of like goes out into the kind of what become the kind of colonies or whatever. So there's already a lot of like so that this kind of process of like internal differentiation and kind of making various cuts is already kind of part of the European imaginary, and then it's kind of exported or whatever with the kind of rise of capitalism. And so I was really interested in that. What did I want to say? Yeah, so that was one of the and so at some point, so that was one of the themes was cannibalism, and it was and that also converged with a kind of ongoing interest I'd had, which I've kind of read a couple. I mean, so my research tends to be like very piecemeal, and it's mainly driven by kind of like enthusiasm or whatever. So I got very enthusiastic about some stuff I read around the idea that you could kind of trace early European kind of proto-race concepts in Europe. So this is kind of like, again, like before the colonial period, kind of concepts that kind of later get fused with the sort of more like anti-black or anti-Semitic or kind of colonial categories or whatever, and they're categories of social shame. So a thing that, I mean, obviously a lot of people work with these because they're super evocative. I wonder if we can skip forward to one of these actually. Sorry. Oh yeah, these. So these were based on like medieval European. They were popular in like England and Germany and I think the Netherlands. I mean, basically all the kind of heartlands of capitalism. That they were kind of shame masks that people who had kind of been had kind of committed sort of like had sort of transgressed social codes. Like often women would be forced to kind of wear these, and these are made out of a kind of like fake wax kind of plastic, and they have these kind of bodies made of this like tacky jewelry or whatever, and That's my favorite. So the idea that there's a kind of social striation thing that's already been constructed in Europe that kind of predates the kind of modern invention of race or whatever, and that it kind of has something to do with social shame, and it has something to do with facial features. I think what the masks kind of really evoke is that there's already this kind of fusion of like shame and kind of appearance and like whatever, and so that was some of what I was interested in, and there was a kind of there was also kind of like love. I mean, whatever. I mean, I'm always on like massive topics, and then I end up with just like some weird shit in a room. I mean, I guess that's always how it is. But like, and and so there's a kind of like love and death kind of strand, which I guess related to the cannibalism. Like, my grandpa died at the beginning of that year, who's like a really important figure in my life, and there's something sort of like somewhat indigestible about his death because he was like a very stringent atheist, and no one else wanted his ashes, and he didn't give a shit. He was like, just throw me in the bin. At one point, I thought of just like having like the trash can. It was just, we were like, what do you want us to do with your ashes? He's like, put them in the bin, the trash. And when he was dying, because he was mad about dying, so I thought about like putting some ashes in a trash can, but like I didn't do that. So initially I had this idea that the initial kind of structure was the idea that there was these two kind of cannibalism rooms which were about kind of like race and like European history, and it was very much like about it being in Germany. So I wanted to kind of like the thing I mentioned, the thing about upper class people like drinking this thing made of dead people, dead, like either like dead executed poor people or like dead like black people, was also really popular in Germany. So I was kind of like, there was some sort of like, I'm being contextual and like whatever, and also that thing, because I think especially at this point maybe it's like eased off a little now, but obviously this was maybe peak. I mean, God knows what the history of this is going to turn out to have been, but it was sort of like peak kind of identity frenzy. So there's a way that you're sort of always like managing then a lot of the work kind of becomes about a sort of management of expectations in relation to how you feel as an artist, and I like talked about this in the seminar the other day, but kind of producing an identity position to be curated or whatever. So I think there was a kind of flight into this kind of like extremely like grand historical narrative that was like, let's talk about Europe, which is kind of what Cedric Robinson does in Black Marxism, where he's like, do you want to talk about race? And then you start it in like 11th century France or whatever, which is kind of the surprise move. So that was so then I kind of basically, so at some point I thought I could do this extremely tender kind of emotionally raw stuff literally with my grandfather's literal ashes. Like this was in the sort of delusional stage of thinking about the show, the early stages where you're just having crazy ideas or whatever, and then actually at some point like late one night I found literally like a note in my phone that was like, art is the wrong place to bury your dead. And I was like, oh, thank you, previous self. Like, what a disaster that would have been. Like, how horrific for me. I mean, obviously if anyone wants to do that, that's cool, but I didn't, it would have been I mean, my yeah, whatever. But anyway, so then I wanted to kind of leave a kind of residue of that. So then I think the idea was that I was like, oh, I'm going to put a domestic door in one of the doorways with a lock, and you're going to have to go and ask for the key, and that's what's going to make this room kind of bearable as a site to do that. And then of course you realize like nothing you do in a gallery is bearable. Kind of like you can't like cleanse off the like aura of the commodity or whatever. I believe you can't do anything that cleanses off which is the problem with the problem with therapeutic art, as I mentioned earlier. But I mean, obviously, whatever, people have different feelings about that. Everyone's entitled to their different feelings. I find that an interesting problem to kind of like rub up against or whatever. But I want to see if I can find another picture of maybe there's not. Yeah, so there's this yellow door, and it had a domestic lock or whatever, and that was like the trace of my attempt to make a sort of private space in the gallery, which was a failure. And then inside, I wonder if it's and then there was a video inside the room, and there was like a carpet again to sort of like continue to evoke something like vaguely domestic or whatever. And then inside there was a pile of ashes, and this was kind of the stand-in for my grandpa's ashes, but it was actually a burned. This is a. I mean, you'll probably get the reference. It's like the thing. This is like the most obvious reference. Maybe it's a burned book. It's from a book that I made for a show. This is from a show at the Chisenhale in London in 2017, I think. But it was I made a bunch of copies of a book called The Situation, which was just a collection of kind of blurred together like transcripts where I just asked friends like, what's the situation, or tell me about a situation or whatever. And it was kind of and then the idea in this show was that you could shred the book, and it was kind of, I guess in some ways the show was a sort of plea for the, the kind of like a sort of like more kind of neutral relationship to destruction or whatever. Yeah, so that was that ended up as this, which is sort of the stand-in. And okay, so this was so thinking about shame. This was wow. Oh yeah, so there were two. Oh my God, I forgot. I think I forgot one of the Curses of Ham. There were two works called The Curse of Ham. This was Curse of Ham 1, and it was as you can see, this like ad banner with two holes burnt in it, like eyes, and then behind it there was this picture from the Steve McQueen movie Shame. It's called Shame, right? About the sex addict. So that's Michael Fassbender. That's the famous full frontal nudity scene. Michael Fassbender. The Curse of Ham, as I mentioned in the quotes, is like a kind of very archaic. I mean, it's kind of so archaic as a kind of like race myth that you almost worry about dredging it back up or whatever. But it's a kind of anti-black racial myth that was like the idea that like one of Noah's sons like saw him drunk and like saw him naked and was like cursed with slavery forever or whatever. So this is a kind of like this is one of the kind of reenactments of that scene, was like Michael Fassbender in Shame, and I think I'm really sad, but I think you should, but if you're interested, which I hope someone out there is, then you should go and look on the website, because there's another work that was in this room that was over there, and that was also these kind of these figures that were like wooden kind of conquistador statues, which are somehow really abundant on German Etsy. So I got a few like wooden conquistador statues, and then made them like weird like neon heads, and then they were like, and one of them had like a light bulb eye, and they were like looking at this one, which this raw clay sculpture, which as the kind of armament below, the infrastructure, the armature below which is just like some polystyrene, like, but I mean, calling it an armature sounds so fancy. It was just like a polystyrene ball or whatever, but like as that was like exposed, it had like the word da on it, like da, which I wanted to kind of evoke, like, like don't look at your father naked, but whatever. So but also like obviously like Freud fought da, whatever. Anyway, so that was going on there. And these TVs with the red screen were kind of a way, I think, because, and this was a kind of almost like self-critique. I was like, I'm operating on such, because of this way, I feel like I'm often like on this very like grand sweep kind of I'm just often like at such a kind of like level of like high abstraction that I try and like bring myself down to earth a little bit. And so this was just TVs that just said like, hey, like they just kind of said like annoying things like someone might say on like a dating app or whatever, just like, hey, what's up, or like whatever, and that kind of thing, until the final room, where unlike the upstairs clay sculptures were mainly of raw clay, and then at some point I was like, because the downstairs is air drying clay. So it's like this is the death room. So there's air drying clay, it's dead and kind of falling apart. And unlike the kind of living upstairs clay, at some point I realized nothing's completely alive. So I put little bits of dead clay in them, of the air dry clay in them as well. But which that was like a kind of weird, like, whatever, like that happened in the process of installing. And and then in this room, the TV says, hey, it's just sometimes I have to forget you're in the room to try and be with you. So that was my kind of like reveal, the kind of like the death and vulnerability room. And and there was a video also on just a TV screen video in that room that had a series of like really like super, very like personal like audio and footage from my phone. And one of those things was from it was like literally a recording from when my grandpa was dying, and this like palliative care nurse came to see him, and he was like, and at some point he was kind of frustrated with the conversation, and he was like, well, I don't know how people die. And then she's like, do you want to know how people die? And obviously like me and my grandparents were just like, yes, like whatever, like she's like, either quick or slow. Like it was so intense. So that's, oh god, so that was like in there, and that was the kind of reference to the mostly failed project to kind of process a kind of that's from the video, that's like snowy landscape near where he lived in Yorkshire in England. That's that thing again, we've seen that, that's the door. Did we go through everything? Chisenhale, with the dead bits, you can see the wood kind of appearing, death, shame. Oh wait, this was it doesn't really matter. It was kind of, this was called Snack, SNAK. It was something of a private joke. It was based on like a kind of joke I had with or a thing with my ex, who's extremely scared of snakes, and then a kind of really intense crush I had while I was working on the show, which, oh, sorry, I'm doing the thing they told me to do, which is where I'm turning towards the screen. A really intense crush I had while I was working on it, which is often I notice happens actually. You have to develop a really like weird, like emotional fixation to like, I mean, maybe not everyone, but I think it's pretty common. You develop kind of like intense emotional fixation to get through the process of working on an exhibition because it's so humiliating and in my opinion. Yeah, and I just bit out. I literally like bit pieces out of this weird kind of like plastic wax thing. This was a video of my friend Jack, who's actually very cute in real life. I made him look terrible, but I mean he's cute in the video. I'm gonna and I'll show you the video of him. I mean it's like obviously the show's about cannibalism, so I had like one young white man talking about having my friend Sam talking about getting replacement tooth made of like ground up human bone, and then this is Jack talking about biting his nails. And so I think we'll end on the video, and then if anyone has any questions, I can take some questions. Oh, that's whatever. Hey, okay.
But I get really anxious if I'm like feeling, maybe it's like a bit exaggerating to say I get really anxious. It sometimes occurs to me that this will never end. Like that I'll never be able to stop biting my nails. And that even if I did, the nails wouldn't grow back. And I just think that's just what my hands are. Wait, the one that's cannibalism alone unites us, like that. And then the world's single law, and then I am only concerned with what is not mine.
Yeah.
Okay. If I bite, I mean I do bite, especially on my thumbs, I bite all around. And I chew, like I bite like the whole edge of my finger off sometimes. Magic in life. I remember being in high school in the 9th grade, and my chemistry teacher was chewing his nails in the class, and he like did this thing. We were writing a test, and I watched him like look to inspect the state of his nails and then decide which one to bite. And that like watching someone do that ritual that was familiar to me made him look like so disgusting and pathetic that I wanted to stop, but I also didn't stop after that. Maybe there was something I remember watching him look at his nails and thinking that like the fastidiousness of it was kind of disturbing. But it doesn't hurt, it feels great. Yeah. So you can bite the whole edge of like a calloused finger off, but that's kind of new. Like my skin didn't used to behave in that way. And there's like several month-long cycles of like what's the best part to chew at. But I'm looking at them now, and the thing that is actually repulsive to me is like dirt. Like there's just dirt under my nails. Yeah. If I could bring my toes to my mouth, I would chew them off with my teeth. The nails, not the whole toe. I think having lots of like predictable, like chaotic feelings or whatever, and like working a lot and stress, so I was biting them really, really badly. And then this guy, Juan, had told me that he'd been to this hypnotist, and after going for one session, he quit smoking. And he was like a pack-a-day smoker for like 10 years, and he just never smoked again. And so I thought I should go for nail biting. Yeah, I was disappointed with the hypnotist because I think like leaving the session, I knew that it hadn't worked and that I wasn't going to go back. And I think probably was biting my nails like within an hour of having been there, which in some way feels like a triumph. Like the fixation is so intense. I always, after I bite it, I always spit it out. But sometimes if I'm in public, I'll like hold it in my fingers for a while, like as though I haven't just bitten my nail, obviously, which is funny doubly because it's like as if anyone is really inspecting what you're doing with your hands in your mouth on the train. But then if they have seen you just bite your nail, obviously holding it in your hands and discarding it later isn't gonna like fool them into thinking that you weren't just biting your nail on the subway. Like they'll have seen it happen. I think I mean there's a bit of like having your hands in your mouth is such like a boundaryless child thing or something. Like you just want to like fill stuff and like feel your own spit or something. Oh, I don't know. It's kind of attractive, like that you could encase the bitten nail in something that reads as unbitten. But it also seems like I would just want to pick it off. Like I've kind of thought about doing it, but I mean, there's many reasons why I haven't done it, I guess, but one of them would be that I think I would just want to pick it off really badly.
Thanks. I think, oh. How does this work? Does anyone have a question? Someone brings you a microphone, I guess. But
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. Can you talk about the process between writing and object making and performing, and if there's like a first, second, third, or if it all happens at the same time, and kind of what the creation story of your projects are?
Oh, thank you. What a nice question. I feel like I'm really a writer, and I like editing because it's like writing, like film editing or video editing. And I have a really ambivalent relationship to objects, but the one that I've somehow not, and I guess in some ways like having objects in the shows is a way to just sort of like dwell in that ambivalence, because obviously I could, you don't have to have objects. Somehow it's never been possible for me to accept you don't have to have objects. And I used to really like idealize the kind of maker, and I still I'm very impressed by sort of like very like abundant natural kind of makers or whatever. I'm not really like that, and I also have a completely perverse relationship to the object making where there's unlike the writing where there's a certain amount of excess on top. I mean, there's things I write that never get published, and because I write for like the like the famous Marx quote about Milton where he's like, Milton writes poetry like a spider spins silk. It's like the activity of his being, and like and the closest thing I have to that is writing, but I don't have that with objects at all. Whereas I do know people who I think would be constantly producing like objects or paintings or drawings even if they weren't under some, even if it wasn't like a professional obligation. So there's very little excess on top of my object making, and I do a really perverse thing, which often really, because often I like collaborate with people at this stage because to sort of slightly soften the like problem or whatever. I just started working with other people who are much more enthusiastic about like materials and stuff. So they'll literally be like, because I'll be like, what material? And I'll be like, oh my god, materials. And then they'll be like, this one or this one, and then I can actually like kind of make a decision once it becomes just like a taste question or something. And obviously I like some things more than others and like whatever, wait, what was it? Oh yeah, so I have this thing where people are often like, I'll be like, should I make this? And I'll be like verbally like working it through with like a friend or whatever, and they'll be like, well, you should try it. And I'm like, no, I can't try it because it might not be a good idea. So I have like an almost like invert, because I think it is actually like if I was going to give advice to like a student or a friend or whatever, I'd be like, yeah, probably you should try things, because often you do surprise. I mean, and I've had that experience, because there is something about working in actual kind of materials that does kind of constantly like, it does force you to kind of find stuff out or whatever that you wouldn't otherwise have done. But yeah, I think the writing's really dominant. The concepts are very dominant, and then somehow the objects are there as a kind of like way to register my failure to be a maker or something. I think so. They are objects, and I think they often have a kind of weird like clunky charm or something, or I hope they do sometimes in some way. But I think that they're very like driven by, they're not so like sensuous in their production or whatever. And oh, what did I want to say about that? I feel like there's something that felt important, but yeah, when I was I did a really fun project with the painter and sculptor Nicole Eisenman like last year or something, where she commissioned me to do a piece of writing for a catalogue for a show in Germany, and and she'd made all these like really, I mean, she's like incredible. She's like really like a maker. She's an incredible artist, like whatever. So she'd made all these sculptures, and they were like, she was like, they're like guys, and like I want you to like write in their personality or whatever. And so like, and so we're having this quite intense like process of talking about the sculptures or whatever. And she's like totally like has a really different way of like thinking and feeling around stuff than obviously we're very different in that way. And then and I think at some point I was like, so I was really, but then I found something about the way she works very like kind of there's something really sympathetic about it as well. And it was somehow through that process. So sorry, maybe this is obviously kind of, I didn't need that whole like backstory, but it was just like that was when I realized, when I really most intensely felt like it was just like, because she'd done this kind of incredible sculpture where she'd showed a sculpture at freeze, so she'd kind of done the like commodification, you know, this like literally like the sculpture had been like fully commodified, it had been shown at like an art fair, it hadn't sold, and she was kind of sad and frustrated about it, so she kind of like just basically like ripped apart the sculpture and made a new one where she put another one kind of inside the ripped apart previous sculpture or whatever, and it was like this tiny figure of a witch inside this like obliterated sculpture, and I was like so impressed. I was like, that's such a like, you know, it's so sort of like I don't know how you describe, you know, it's like very like in control of your materials or whatever. You're just like, I'm like the witch, and I can destroy my own work if I want to because I can remake it and like whatever. And then somehow I thought that the frustrating thing about writing is it's really hard to show you can't show your fuck ups in that way. Like it's writing, the only way you can kind of show the ways you've like made and remade it is kind of quite affected. You know, you'd have to kind of do something like there was like a kind of like poetic affectation to be like, I mean, and like everyone kind of knows you could have deleted that part or whatever. So I think so I think there's something about the writing has no surface. It doesn't show its surface. There's nothing, no like trace can appear on the surface. So I think in some way that problem of writing, and that problem, which is obviously across all the kind of writing forms including performance to an extent, is the reason that somehow there still has to be an object, because there still has to be some like register of like failure, kind of this more, which is kind of a self-protective thing, because of course if you're like self-consciously registering failure, you're also protecting yourself against the ways you've like genuinely failed, and maybe it just like isn't whatever. So I guess they're kind of all like connected, but in ways that there's definitely like a dominant, you know, it's like a dominant hand or whatever, which is like the writing stuff, and then everything kind of like, and I think that's the reason I like have a career or whatever. I mean, that's like if my writing is why I don't think it's like people aren't going to be like, whoa, this sculpture's incredible or whatever. Whereas there are people who I think it's like a kind of visual acuity that's like them. I think as an artist, like in this, maybe it's super basic, but just took me a while to like accept whatever. Like everyone just has different kind of like engines of and it's specific to you and how you work, whatever. For some people, it's that they are just like astonishingly visually kind of funny and weird or whatever, and then for other people, it's something that resides in another place. So I think it's like something about the energy of the writing is the thing that kind of like propels people's interest in my work, at least, or and my own interest in it as well. So yeah, thank you for the fun question.
Thank you so much for that talk. It was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
You said that you used to believe that art could be healing or therapeutic, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what you used to believe and like what happened that made you stop believing.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think what I was trying to say maybe is it's something I can never quite leave. Like I can never quite leave that possibility behind, but I always have to be careful with it, because I think when you're thinking about especially like making, you know, and you know, like if you're thinking about like professional practice as a contemporary artist, what you're dealing with is like you know, like markets and like kind of like a certain kind of like circulation of discourse, and all these things have very little to do. They're not positioned. It's as if you go into a bank and be like, let's do meditation or whatever, which should maybe be cool, but it'd be kind of, you know, it's like something like weird or whatever. You're always in a kind of strangeness of like, or a kind of like art institutions and art galleries aren't really set up. I mean, I guess now people are trying to kind of retrofit it, and it's a kind of interesting process. But I think for me, it's important to kind of maintain that as like an actual problematic, and not to just completely collapse it into either like. And maybe one way of collapsing it would be to totally give up on the idea of a kind of therapeutic content of art, which would be also kind of lie, because obviously in reality, like what is, you know, like most people to some extent everyone's emotional investment, not everyone, but most people's emotional investment in art is partly that, you know, you're just like, I feel better when I do, and even, and you know, the classic like James Baldwin thing where you're like, oh, I realize other people throughout history felt as bad as I do or whatever, and that's somehow like kind of a nice feeling, even though it doesn't mean anyone's necessarily feeling good, but you're like, at least I can like whatever. So, but at that point, I think there was also kind of like a sort of like very recent history trajectory or whatever, which maybe other people share and maybe some people don't, which was just, I think there was a kind of a sort of like, there was a feeling of like slight opening that happened kind of around right after like the kind of, I feel there was that kind of era in 2016 and early 2017 where I think there was a sort of revelation kind of quality going on, where it's like things that had previously been in a sphere of maybe like radical critique just kind of burst into the mainstream. So suddenly you had all these kind of mainstream commentators just like scrambling to be like, how is it that racist politicians are so popular? So then you had this kind of arrival into the mainstream of all this stuff that people have previously obviously been saying. I mean, this is the thing you always have to like pay tribute to. Obviously, people have been saying this for a long time, but there've been this kind of like arrival in in mainstream discourse, which had not only then, but I think there was a real intensity to that thing, and it kind of very briefly, I think, felt like, I mean, and now it seems hard to like reconstitute this, but I think very briefly felt like it might be possible when people were genuinely just like bewildered, and like just people who maybe hadn't like, you know, so you had like general audiences who maybe wouldn't previously have been open to certain forms of criticism or insight, kind of really looking for it or whatever. So it felt like you could do some kind of like therapeutic kind of like re-stitching together thing or whatever. And then that completely evaporated. I think that just evaporated. And then you kind of had the like ossification of the like hashtag resistance kind of whatever thing. And now it's just, you know, so I think that, whether like maybe, you know, whatever. So I don't know. So I think it was two things. I think one was that there's a constant sort of movement back and forth for me, and I think for a lot of people, between like the kind of possibility of art as a kind of directly therapeutic content, and then because it's not therapy. You know, if you wanted to do therapy, you'd go and be a therapist. So I think it's something about like sort of acknowledging the ways that like it doesn't. I mean, and maybe you could think, oh, but it's therapy on a mass scale or whatever. But I think there's kind of ways that like, at least I believe that to be truly therapeutic, something has to be like relational kind of. So I think there's a way that art and there was like the relational aesthetic stage, and everyone was kind of like mad at that or whatever, because there is a problem, and it is the problem of like what happens when you put that stuff in an art institution. You can't just like pretend. Yeah, you can't just pretend you're not doing your meditation in a bank. Like, sure, like go and meditate in a bank, but don't be like, I'm in a meadow or whatever. Everyone's like, you know. So I think that's the thing, and maybe I said it too tough because I don't want to admit that I'm still like, oh, and I think it's almost like it's easier to admit in like poetry, the poem that I read by David Antin at the beginning, where he's like, oh, I hope we're somehow connecting through this kind of like humanness or whatever. And that's also kind of funny because I actually really like some of his I only came across them recently, but his kind of like rambling, making up as he's going poems, and that's a beautiful one where it's like, oh, maybe we can connect through our humanness. But then I read another one recently. This would be an example of like the problems of therapy and yourself as the therapist as an artist. So this is like David Antin doing another like rambling, making up as he's going on, like beautiful whatever kind of poem, and then suddenly there's a whole part where he's like, maybe Islam is bad or whatever, and you're just like, whoa, okay, because it's just like, yeah, it's like an older white guy who's just like saying whatever comes into his head, so some of that's going to be, so I guess it's like maybe it's, and I think for some people who are artists or art practitioners in whatever way, it might be easy, and for me it's hard, but for some people it might genuinely, for reasons of their own being, be easier to put themselves in that position. And I think there are people who do it pretty well and are just like, I am willing to be that object for other people, and I believe in myself. I think it's just I don't have that degree. But so it's not to kind of completely dismiss the possibility. I just think it requires a certain like, I think I'd encourage people to be self-critical when they're engaging in that and think about the institutions they're embedding the therapy in, and even maybe therapists should do that as well. Therapists should think about the institutions that the therapy is embedded in. Like if therapists are working as like psychiatrists or whatever, and that's often like, you know, like with the DSM, which is a technology of social control and violence or whatever. Like people should be thinking always about that. That it might depend on people's individual like kind of autobiographical like things and how they're willing to kind of conduct themselves as a person in the world or whatever. But thanks.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you approach the concept of failure. You spoke about a little bit, but I think there's a related but different concept of refusal that I've also heard, and I think it perhaps comes more to the fore in the writing versus the objects that you've shown us. But I'm curious about how you understand these two ideas of failure on the one hand and refusal on the other hand.
Thank you so much for that question, because I actually wrote something a really long time ago when I had a brief, this is kind of embarrassing now, but I was briefly kind of interested in like post-punk, I think, the kind of music, whatever, some like, I don't know, like indie music from like the 80s or whatever, and mainly in the UK or whatever. I think it was like dating related. Like I was dating someone who thought that was cool. But like but but then I got really into this kind of very. But now I'm not going to remember it very well. But I got into this kind of like really like cute story about this band magazine, and they're the only band who there's a show like Top of the Pops that was like really big in England, and like everyone who went on it always sold more records. Like that was just how it worked. You go on Top of the Pops, you get like clout and exposure. They didn't call it clout then, but like whatever. And then you sell more records. And they were the only band who went on it and did not sell more records because the lead singer did such a bad job. And I read about this in the Simon Reynolds book. He's like a music, like whatever, like cultural critic kind of person or whatever. And he's really hard on them. He's like, yeah, they really screwed up. It was terrible. And they like pretended that it was deliberate because later the lead singer's like, oh, I did it deliberately because I didn't want to sell out or whatever. I mean, this concept of selling out feels so archaic now, but this was when people cared about that or whatever. He was like, I didn't want to sell out, so that's why I did a bad performance. And then Simon Reynolds is like, he couldn't have done a good performance if he tried. And I wrote this thing where I really felt sympathetic to the guy from magazine, and I felt that I was like, but maybe that's the most punk thing is obviously there's something about incompetence and punk and refusal. There's something about failure and refusal that you can never totally disengage because the full refusal would also be to fail, kind of. And I do think there's something about maybe it is about the closure of like not selling out, which I understand is because you get this intensification of like there has been what seems to be somewhat of an intensification of like the total financialization of every aspect of like life or whatever, and the total kind of like which you could argue has always been the case in some like like whatever, like I think whenever you talk about like historical tendencies, you're always like, what about black people, or like what about queer people, whatever. So there's always like those things you have to like put on it. But I think it feels like there's been a total, like everyone's like everything's more sort of like financialized. So I think that has somewhat shut off an idea of like saying like fuck you no or whatever. But I do think that it is for me it is a kind of shrinking terrain you have to hold on to, because otherwise really like why be an artist as well. I know people partly do it because they think they maybe could make a lot of money and have an easy life, and that's a totally noble pursuit. I really support people trying to have an easy life, but I think recently I've been trying to think about, like I think sometimes, so I think it is, it does, I think it's a really important category to hold on to just be like, no, I don't want to or whatever. And I think it's like there's various ways that constantly kind of recurs. Like people have phases where they're like, there was that, I think there was a sort of like a 2010 phase of like everyone was really into like Bartleby, like that I would prefer not to thing from that, like there's a Melville like novella I think or short story where like, but there's Bartleby's like a kind of secretary in this company, and he's like whatever, and there's actually a really interesting like background. So I hope a couple of people are familiar with this. It's like Bartleby the scrivener, and he just like doesn't really want to do anything. He just won't do anything. And then whenever his boss is like, why won't you do anything? He's like, I'd prefer not to. I've read a thing about it that says actually, because Melville was one of the few like genuine, he was like a white writer who was like genuinely and passionately like anti-slavery. So he's kind of like a good white guy or whatever. And there's an argument that was actually part of the kind of embedded like thing of the story, that probably one of the things this kind of secretary like whatever would have been, or the like clerk or whatever would have been dealing with, would have been like administrating because business, which at that time was obviously like dominated by or potentially could have been like shipping and like slavery and so on. So refusal is but that was just like one thing I read. Yeah, I think refusal is really important. I think people do have to, I really, I mean, this is like a very sincerely held belief. I think you really have to hold on. I mean, just like generally in life, like what do you do without the capacity to say like, I just think it's terrible to give away the capacity to say no. Of course, also you need, I mean, that's maybe something where I don't do as well. I'm like, what about saying yes? And like affirmation can be important. I think again, this maybe goes back to the therapy question, because I think art that's more directly therapeutic tends to come from more affirmative relation to art. For me, the art I'm interested in doesn't have an affirmative relation to art, and maybe has more like a negative relation to art, in the sense of art, and which is also quite conventional. So you could say that, and I think there's a sort of like, there's obviously a lot of like ambiguities and grey areas around that. So I think often like, so there's a thing right now where I think a lot of the kind of reactionary, the current like forces of reaction in art, the sort of like anti-fascist, like you can't quite say they're fascist, but they're not anti-fascist, so they're like anti-fascist is the formulation I've come up with for a certain kind of like tendency or whatever in art, and I won't be too specific about, but I guess I don't want to get in trouble, but like that they often, I think there's a sort of that ends up a weird sort of affirmation of negation, where it's like why, like, so I think they're they're somewhat horrified by kind of like affirmative tendencies in like identity art. And so this is a really generous reading of what's going on in the anti-fascist tendency. But I think sometimes what ends up weirdly happening is a kind of conservative image of iconoclasm. So it's like people haven't noticed. It's quite sort of like boomer, as people like to say it, where it's like people haven't noticed that their iconoclasm has been fully sort of like incorporated into like a certain kind of mainstream or whatever. So I think you know, like you have to it's not only you have to kind of say no and you have to refuse and you have to fail and you have to like be willing to kind of screw up to make things possible or whatever. I really think so, but also that in reality, I mean, of course, you can also do the affirmative and building and kind of communal stuff, and that's already great. And it depends what your positionality is to be able to do that. But to the degree that one is to some extent an atomized subject, you have to be capable of saying like no, fuck you, and you also have to keep finding new ways of doing that, because you can't just keep doing it in the same way, because the thing that was like no, fuck you 5 years ago might no longer be the thing that. So you know, and that's very evident, because you get different kinds of like in art, where you get different kinds of like curatorial trends or whatever. You have to kind of, I don't know. And then you could say that and then of course it's like even the forces of negativity can themselves be recuperated by like value. And it's like, and I once asked Fred Moten something similar to that in a talk a few years ago, and he was like, oh, you just can't be worried about that or whatever. And I was like, it's just like, oh well, I mean, so, but again, I mean, yeah, so I think refusal is really crucial, and is a space of freedom. And it's like, and obviously freedom is the idea of like, I mean, I also really appreciate this from Moten and from other people, from various like legal scholars and so on, the idea that like freedom and kind of bondage or slavery have been legislatively and historically like bound together or whatever, that somehow like freedom isn't completely free or whatever. But I think insofar as there's any like horizon of like liberation, I think you have to keep asserting it as your capacity to kind of say no, kind of, and as well as like your capacity for like joy and pleasure and all these other things that are nice or whatever. So yeah, I'm into that. Wow, it's 9. What does it mean? Oh no, it's fine. We have like probably like we could do one more. What do you think? Or not? 0 more. Okay, should we do one more? Everyone's like, I refuse to ask a question.
Thank you very much for this. You put yourself out in the raw. It's phenomenal, very intimate in many ways, very courageous. One question: you've said that, or I don't know if you've said it, but people have said that you've said that contemporary art is fundamentally a white supremacist institution.
Did I say that? Oh, I guess so. But most things are, right? What isn't? Like literally what? Name one thing that isn't a white, in current, you know? Like, are we sure there's anything?
Presidency, you mean? No, sorry.
Yeah, it's true, yeah. The presidency is not fundamentally a white. No, sorry, I mean, I know you're kidding.
Things have evolved?
Sorry?
Do you think things have evolved? Are they evolving? On that note, do you still think that's true?
I mean, I guess it would be like, I think it's sort of like, maybe it sounds, if you say white supremacy, it maybe makes people feel weird, because then they're like, are you saying I'm racist or something? But it's funny, because if I said like it's a fundamentally capitalist institution, I don't think people say, are you saying I'm rich or whatever? So I think in the sense that I think what we're currently like dealing with is a kind of moment of critique or whatever, is the idea that, sorry, I'm not trying to like make you like a like whatever, because you're going to feel like, what I also want to say this with respect or whatever, but because it's like it's not a big deal. It's like I think the current mode of critique, and it could be that a new mode is coming and I'm like open to it, but it seems like pretty convincingly the current modality of critique is to assert that capitalism, and this would be like the Cedric Robinson point, and even in some of Marx or whatever, the point would be that capitalism is fundamentally, it has fundamental kind of it's kind of entangled with like white supremacy and also with like in different ways with kind of patriarchal social forms, and that these are sort of, to some extent, I mean, obviously they have different histories, but to some extent are kind of mutually reinforcing each other, and you see that very clearly in someone like Trump. It's almost like it almost feels like too obvious to say, because you have someone like that in power, so you're just like, oh, like it seems pretty clear that all these things are somehow related. So I think that the claim about contemporary art, and it's not. So I think often it comes across as if I've surveyed all the possible cultural forms and I've picked art, but it is literally just I ended up working as an artist. So to the extent I'm someone who like enjoys being critical and likes and also feels it's important to be critical to whatever extent anything is important. That's where I put my critical energy. But I don't think contemporary art is like in a worse situation. I mean, institutionally, I'm not sure it's in a worse situation. And obviously, there have been efforts. I mean, I think it is kind of. I think, in terms of like, I mean, is the question like, are there more black artists and like trans artists and whatever? Like, I guess it's specifically beyond white supremacy. Are there more like black and indigenous artists being shown? Yeah, that does seem to be the case, and I think sort of interesting conversations are coming up around that. I think because I think for me, what's of interest would be some kind of. I mean, I know it sounds pathetic, but would be. I mean, to stand here on a stage like this and talk about like liberation politics or whatever. But I think, I mean, to the extent I'm just like a person suffering in the world or whatever, like and whatever. I think you do hope for some sort of horizon of liberation, even if it has to be kind of somewhat like a faith structure or whatever. I mean, and you see people actually working towards that in real life or whatever. So you see that it's a potential kind of a galvanizing horizon or whatever. So I think that's why it's interesting to talk about white supremacy, and it's not because it's just like we're going to morally cleanse ourselves of being bad people, which we previously were or whatever. It's more like to look at like a total social situation in which I think. Most of the world is like structured around is evidently structured around white supremacy in the way that's so basic to say it's almost embarrassing to kind of go over it. And I think that's also what's a bit like frustrating right now. And I think that is a frustrating thing about, and it also maybe somehow the current moment feels a bit dry. Like there was a really good tweet by Doreen St. Felix, who's like a young black writer living in New York, who was like who writes the New Yorker and stuff, and she was like our age is historic but not iconic. And I think that's really true. And I think people feel frustrated because like it's so boring to just keep being like stuff is like white supremacist and capitalist and patriarchy. You're just like, yes, I know, whatever, okay. But it's like kind of that. I think that's the problem. There's a stasis happening right now, and I don't know what it'll be that'll like re-explode it. I think the problem is you don't have a lot of like I mean, especially here, there's not so many interesting like mass social struggles happening. So I think that usually tends to be the like the kind of cauldron of like new critique or whatever. And I think you had this huge moment with Ferguson and post-Ferguson here, which was extremely enlightening for so many people and really kind of created new conditions of thought. And then kind of like since then, it's been, I think, a little bit hard to kind of reconstitute a sort of like sense of like mass struggle, partly because that was like suppressed so intensely, and a lot of the people involved in that have been like killed in mysterious circumstances and like whatever. So I think it is just, unfortunately, we're in a boring time. It's just like yes, we're living through an intense historical upheaval, but there's not much to say apart from shit, it's crazy or whatever. But or that things are white supremacist and capitalist and so on. But yeah, I don't know if art's any worse than any. I don't think art's like particularly egregious or anything. And I think there's like nice people working in art or like interesting people working in art who are trying to like address things in various ways. And obviously, I'm standing here saying this stuff, so it's like whatever. But I think that's partly because there's a kind of indifference at the center of art, where you can kind of just do whatever as long as it's like kind of interesting or whatever. So I think that kind of enables a lot of interesting things to happen. But partly through this kind of weird mechanism of indifference. So yeah, did that kind of answer? It's sometimes when I hear myself quoted back, I'm like, oh, I see why people think I'm whatever, but yeah, can neither confirm nor deny that I said that. Yeah. Is that the end, or should we? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.